Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everybody. I hope you're doing well. We appreciate you taking time out of your day to spend time with us and talk about rethinking business communication and the risks that are associated with all the different ways that people communicate today. My name is Chris Lehman, and I'm the CEO of SafeGuard Cyber, and I'm absolutely thrilled to be a part of this all-star panel of cybersecurity leaders. SafeGuard Cyber has been partnering with NightDragon for many years now, and we're very, very lucky to have Dave DeWalt to participate in today's session. Dave is the leader of NightDragon, but in addition to Dave, we've also got a number of fantastic practitioners, folks who have many, many years of experience in cybersecurity. And before we get started, I want to ask each of you to please take a moment to introduce yourself and explain what it is that you do and your background in cybersecurity. So why don't we start with Adam?
Hey, thanks, Chris. Adam Gladstone. Hi, everyone. I'm currently the head of cyber risk intelligence product over at Marsh. I've been in the security field for almost about 30 years, really focused on launching cyber risk product and service for the last 10 or 15. Really moved into the insurance space about 10 years ago, had my own company called Broad Street Labs. We were a cyber insurance brokerage and risk advisory firm, and really parlayed that over into the work I'm doing on the product side. So really happy to be here, Chris, and looking forward to the conversation.
Fantastic. Thanks, Adam. Okay, Gary.
Hi, I'm Gary Hayslip, CISO at SoftBank Investment Advisors, both the Vision Fund and Vision Fund 2. Yeah, same as Adam. I've been in cyber and in IT for over 30 years, both on the military and government side and on private industry and financial services. Wide range of experience working with everything from startups to large corporations, and looking forward to today's discussion.
Fantastic. All right, thank you. Rami.
Thank you, Chris, for having me, and very happy to be here. Rami Hussaini, I'm a digital trust lead at BNP Paribas. We're a global bank. As you could tell from my hairstyle, I've also been in the field for quite some time as well. So very excited to talk about this and really learn from everyone today. So thanks for having me.
Super. Thank you for being here. Christoph.
Thank you, Chris. I'm Christoph Pailo. I'm Chief Cybersecurity Officer with Bosch. And as you might guess from my hair color, I'm in the field quite a bit in various roles in IT security, now leading cybersecurity, and always connected with AI. I came to Bosch to build up the AI center of Bosch, and so trying to bring the new possibilities of AI to cyber and use them for the defense of big, large networks. This is my current endeavor, and it's so interesting. I can tell you, enjoying to be here.
May we live in interesting times, right? That's the saying, and I think we certainly live in interesting times. Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Christoph. Prabhat.
Hey, folks. This is Prabhat. I go by PK. Thanks for having me here, Chris and team. I am the VP CISO at Navan. Navan is an all-in-all travel and expense management mobile-first SaaS platform with over 10,000 customers. I run a full-spectrum security organization here, been here for 3 years. Spent a decade at Adobe, was one of the founding members of the security organization there, and grew that team up as the business ramped up from $30 to $300 billion. Been in cyber for 20 plus years, come from an engineering and / consulting background. Excited to be here.
Fantastic. Thank you, PK. Okay, and Dr. Ron Layton.
Chris and team, thanks for allowing me the opportunity to participate. Ron Layton, currently the Chief Security Officer at the Advanced Energy Group. Previous experiences include the federal government, the U.S. Secret Service, Department of Homeland Security, where I was the Deputy Director of the National Cybersecurity Division, Deputy CIO at the service, went on to become the technical liaison to Barack Obama, left the government, went to work in the financial services sector, for about 5 years. Again, currently CSO at the Advanced Energy Group, about 30 years of experience in technology and IT, and just happy to be here. Thanks again, team.
Thank you, Dr. Layton. Well, as you can all see, we've got an absolute, like I said earlier, all-star team, folks who have really witnessed and been a part of the creation and the growth of cybersecurity. And over the last 10, 20, 30 years, this industry has really emerged. And undoubtedly, one of the best leaders that we have in cybersecurity is Dave DeWalt. And as I mentioned earlier, we're very, very lucky to be able to partner with Dave and NightDragon. But Dave's got a very unique perspective because he's not just been the CEO of multiple cybersecurity companies. As a part of being a CEO, he's had to be a practitioner and be a part of actually running and having cybersecurity teams protect the businesses that he's led. And after his career as an operator and a CEO, he then moved on to become an investor and started NightDragon. And NightDragon is one of the preeminent cybersecurity venture capital firms in the world. They focus exclusively on cybersecurity. And as a part of those responsibilities, Dave's had an opportunity to really see all aspects of cybersecurity, the challenges that organizations are faced with today. So I want to start off today's meeting by asking Dave to provide his perspective on some of the biggest threats that he sees organizations facing, and what are the big trends that might emerge over the coming years for cybersecurity professionals. Dave?
I'm smiling, Chris, because first of all, thank you for having me. But second of all, thanks for being the moderator. Usually I'm the host and the moderator as well, and I get to do that role. But Adam, Gary, Christoph, PK, Ron, thank you for joining us here today as well. I have a lot of respect for chief security officers, chief information security officers. I also chair safety and security for Delta Airlines, as probably some of you know. So from a board role, I get a lot of the visibility of the challenges there, and have had almost 20 years running companies in the cyber and national security market. So I'm not up to 30 years yet, like some of you, but I'm trying to catch up. But Chris, thanks for having me, and it's great to partner with you as well. We've known each other a long time, so thank you for that. Maybe I'll just start out by making a couple comments if I could. We just hosted at NightDragon our third annual State of Cybersecurity event last week, a 3-hour session, podcast type session. For those diehards that can stay awake for 3 straight hours of cyber, we pulled it off last week. But what was fascinating is we tried to get a 360-degree view on sort of the year in review, sort of 2023, and sort of the year ahead, 2024. From many angles. One was a CISO angle to really understand what chief information security officers were looking at, but also from partners, go-to-market partners, distributors, value-added resellers, system integrators, but also from Wall Street. And we had some of the most powerful sell-side analysts who have been covering most of the hack index. This is the large cybersecurity companies like Palo Alto Networks and CrowdStrike and others. But we also got a venture capital view, so kind of an early stage view, and a bit of a government view, and a bit of an AI view as well. So we tried to get kind of different angles to look at it. And I'll try to give you like 3 or 4 points in a couple minutes here that really stood out. First of all, I think it's universal that we're living in interesting times, Chris, as you kind of alluded, which is both a curse and a blessing, right? The blessing part is we're not bored. It's a really crazy environment. The curse side is we're living in a very difficult time too. I call it the perfect cyber storm. I've been talking about this for darn near 20 years, literally every year. I call it the perfect cyber storm. And what it is that you just see this massive inertia of technology that we just come to love, ever since, the internet rolled out, mobile phones rolled out, now generative AI rolls out. We're just seeing a constant wave of technology. which is a wonderful thing. But the bad news is it's leaving a wake of vulnerabilities. That wake of vulnerabilities is an increasing attack surface for the bad guys. And there's more and more bad guys, right? When I was CEO of FireEye and Mandiant, we tracked about 800 threat groups, real permanent threat actors. Just a few years later, we have 3,500. So almost a 5x growth in bad guys. This is almost outnumbering the number of cyber companies that we have. And last year alone, we saw almost 1,953 net new bad guy groups show up. So to be a CISO and you're up against 3,500 bad actors with thousands and thousands of attacks a day, it's a tough job. And so we're living in the highest threat environment we've ever had. We're also compounding that with living in the highest regulatory environment we've ever had as well. For a long time, we had some regulation for cyber, but it's growing. I mean, many of you have seen what the SEC has put out in 2023 about incident reporting. A lot of questions and consternation of what does materiality mean. Different what's called SRMAs, or sector regulated management agencies, are also putting out cyber specific rulemaking. Being in the Delta Airlines world, the TSA has put out specific controls around industrial, but other industry sectors have other regulations they're dealing with. So you have a high threat environment, a high regulation environment, and almost no end in sight to that perfect storm kind of problem. So therefore, most budgets are up pretty substantially yet again going into 2024. We're facing a whole plethora of new threats and new challenges as we go into perhaps one of the most interesting years in history. Most of 64 countries are up for elections in 2024, affecting almost 4 billion people on the planet. And what's the biggest threat most everyone agrees to, including the World Economic Forum in Davos, is that misinformation and disinformation as the biggest existential threat, brought on by social media platforms, brought on by speed and virality of information, and now brought on by the threat of generative AI, where creating deepfakes is easier and easier. Many of you might have seen what even happened in the New Hampshire primaries with President Biden's robocalling of a deepfake, alerting citizens not to vote. And we're just seeing the tip of the iceberg of many, many new types of threats coming from generative AI and all kinds of areas of unique challenges that are caused by that. I think we'll also talk about today the positives that can come out of generative AI and AI as well. So there's a good news, bad news thing that's going on with that new technology wave. But one of the reasons we're here today is to really talk about one of the biggest threats that I'm seeing, and that is our new type of communications, not just the content within those communications potentially being false or false narratives around that content, but really the uptake of types of communications that most every enterprise has. The days of doing email and the days of only doing email as a main communication are far over. Almost half of all business communications is now something other than email. I'm sure most of you use Teams or WhatsApp or some other methodology that your company and organization has put in place, but we're watching that grow, and the business criticality of those channels grow as well, and the threat within those channels grow even more, and most of those channels aren't protected. So when you start to look at the threat, where we've had a lot of layers of email security but barely any layers of other types of channels of communications and protection, we have a big threat in that area. So rethinking business communication security, the theme of today, kind of a digital danger zone, is a real and present danger that we're facing. So Chris, thanks for having me, and let's get on to the experts if we can, and we'll listen to them.
Dave, that was a fantastic overview, and just a great segue, because I think we're going to hit on a lot of the big trends and threats and opportunities that you mentioned. So thank you very much. Okay, so as I mentioned, Dave really gave a great kind of tee up to the conversation today. And when I describe the challenges that organizations are faced with today, I always like to talk about this intersection of very, very mega trends that are existing in the world and the way we communicate and the way we do business. And it all starts with the fact that the way we communicate has changed. Dave just mentioned this. 45% of all business communication today now takes place outside of email. And you combine that fact with the reality that human beings will always be the biggest vulnerability and most challenging variable for security teams to control. And you get this perfect storm. The fact of the matter is, no matter how much training you do, no matter how much awareness you create, the human eye is not going to be able to detect a lot of the very sophisticated attacks that are targeted against them. This was challenging enough when they just had to worry about email and phishing attacks in email. But now they're using collaboration applications like Slack and Teams. They're using conferencing applications like Zoom. They're using mobile messaging applications like WhatsApp and Telegram and Line. And all of these threats, all of these very high frequency attacks that have historically been targeted at email channels are now occurring in these new alternative communication channels. Not to mention the fact that with all of these new channels that employees use to communicate, bad acting or malicious employees are using these channels as an evasion technique, as a method and a way to exfiltrate data, intellectual property, information that is meant to stay inside the four walls of a corporation, and they're using these channels to move that data outside of the corporation. Not to mention the fact that the techniques that bad actors are using has evolved and changed. It's no longer just about security teams detecting malicious files or malicious links. We now have language-based attacks that go under the radar and circumvent the traditional security stack of technologies, using things like urgency and deception and appeals for assistance. And all of those techniques go undetected by your traditional log-based technology or agent-based technology. And then, of course, Dave mentioned generative AI. And I know that generative AI is something that has become a very commonly understood and used phrase or term over the last year. But the reality is, SafeGuard Cyber has been leveraging large language model technologies for the last 8 years. So it's something we're very, very familiar with. And these are all challenges that can seem overwhelming for security practitioners. The good news is there are answers, there are ways that we can solve these challenges. On the right-hand side of this slide, here's a very classic example of an attacker leveraging multiple communication channels to basically spam an organization to see who will take the bait. But you'll notice they aren't just doing this in email, they're doing this across multiple channels, and they're leveraging social engineering or language-based attacks or techniques to deceive the target into doing something that they shouldn't. These types of attacks are happening every single day. They are circumventing your traditional security controls, and these are the challenges that we're here to speak about today. Now, one of the slides that I like to show and things that I like to talk about, because I think it really surprises people, is just how much individuals are using these alternative channels. Most people think that email is ubiquitous and everybody's using it, but when you compare the number of email users today on an average monthly basis, and you compare that to mobile messaging applications dwarf the number of email users. And it's just a great illustration of the challenge that we as security practitioners and solution providers face when it comes to securing our employees' communication and securing our businesses. I think some great examples where the new attack techniques have been illustrated or become obvious. Some high-profile breaches would be the Uber breach that occurred last year. In the Uber breach, the attacker had stolen legitimate user credentials off the dark web, so they were able to log in to the corporation's, to Uber's Slack channel. And within the Slack channel, they targeted an employee by spamming them with password reauthorization attempts. But in addition to targeting the employee, and by the way, they were impersonating Uber's IT department. In addition to targeting the employee inside of Slack, they also had their WhatsApp number, and they were sending the employee messages on their WhatsApp number, telling them that, hey, this is the IT department, and we need you to approve that password reauthorization. So the employee just assumed that this must be legitimate and did not realize that this was actually a bad actor impersonating the IT department. And as a result of this, the APT29, who's largely understood to be the attack group behind this, was leveraging social engineering techniques. They were leveraging multiple communication channels, and they ultimately were able to get the employee to do a password reauthorization. They were able to get a foothold, move laterally, and ultimately exfiltrate data. Another great example where almost identical attack occurred would be Take-Two. Take-Two is the manufacturer of Grand Theft Auto, the largest and most profitable gaming franchise in the world and in history. And the same exact techniques were used: stolen credentials in combination with contacting the employee with a mobile messaging app. These would be great examples of inbound attacks that security teams need to be aware of. Another example would be the National Crime Association. This is a very recent example where a high-level director of the NCA, which is a government agency in the UK, used their WhatsApp account to exfiltrate private and confidential sensitive information. They were ultimately caught and are now being prosecuted. And these are just some recent examples of how bad actors, whether they are external or internal, are leveraging alternative communication channels to execute their mission. And then finally, as if all of these challenges and megatrends aren't making the challenge hard enough, it is a lot of regulatory and legal groups and agencies are now putting extra pressure on corporations and enterprises to do something about this. We saw the DOJ back in March of 2023 provide guidance indicating that all corporations need to develop policies around the preservation and deletion of communications. And from their perspective, it doesn't matter if a communication had to do with the business, whether it was company sanctioned or not, whether the company issued and controls that application or not. The expectation of the DOJ is that the corporation will be able to get access to those communications. Then the SEC and the cyber disclosure law around mandatory reporting of material incidents within a 4-day time period came out. And this adds pressure to organizations to develop a consistent policy of determining when an attack is material and when it's not, and then having the controls in place that allow them and enable them to report out that they've had a material incident. These are big challenges, and it's why we are big believers in the inevitability of organizations, corporations putting controls in place to secure not just traditional channels like email, but all of the communication channels that their employees are no doubt using to execute their jobs. Okay, so with that said, let's move on to our panelist discussion. And I want to start, Gary, with you. And we've talked about this explosion of alternative communication channels. And when you trace this back to its origins, it really comes back to the popularity of smartphones. And smartphones ushered in a number of very, very popular alternative communication approaches, whether they were cloud-based applications like a Slack or a Teams or mobile messaging applications. And it's basically forced corporations to make a decision around BYOD. Are they going to be a corporation that locks down and prevents the employees from leveraging and using their own personal devices? Or are they going to continue to allow them to use that? And I know that every corporation needs to make that decision on their own, but would love your perspective about how a security team or practitioner can go about making the right decision for their business.
Well, I mean, I think the big discussion is, the first thing we have is it's just a discussion on data protection, and are you regulated, and how are you going to manage your data, and then it's just a reminder of, okay, they're small handset, but it's still a computer when you really look at it. It's still a computer that you can store a ton of data in, that's highly mobile, and they can be easily stolen. And so what's going to be on these things, and how are you going to be sharing data on these things? And then the whole discussion is all right, if we're not going to allow BYOD, and if we're going to go ahead and issue out an organizational cell phone, again, just as you mentioned, those apps can get you in trouble because they're just growing like magic mushrooms, and they can do so many different things with them. And you start having discussions of, all right, what are we going to allow? What's going to be the use cases for it? And again, it's a management of data, and who should have access to it, and what visibility do we have on these endpoints to be able to control how data is managed. And so, yeah, I mean, I look at just the proliferation of these handhelds, and then the apps that are on them. To me, it's just an extension of the endpoint. They start with the desktop and with the laptop, and then it moves to the handset. And so for me, the policies are just an extension. And then another discussion we have with our users as well is, hey, think about what you're putting on these things. If we have an e-discovery request, if we have a litigation request, we're going to request your phone to go ahead and pull an image. Now, if it was a BYOD environment, would you really want us asking for your personal phone and what's on? And most people are like, no, they don't even want to give up their personal phones. Okay, that's the reason why we're giving a corporate phone. Keep business on business devices, and oh, by the way, constantly be thinking about what you're doing with these devices.
Yeah, I always like to tell the story. I had a meeting with some bankers a few months back, and we were having coffee, and both of these two gentlemen that I met with literally sat down and put two phones on the table. You go to a meeting, you put your phone on the table. Well, they came and they put two phones on the table, and I had to laugh, and I said, well, I'm assuming one of those is your personal device, and there you go, and one is your company issued device. And I know that there's no one answer when it comes to allowing BYOD or issuing corporate owned devices. But what we're big believers in, or what I believe in, is the power of choice, right? And what we always tell our customers is that we want to give you the ability to go either route, and know that if you decide to allow BYOD, we'll make sure that your employees can communicate in a secure and compliant manner. Or if you want to issue your own devices, we can give you the tools you need to make sure that your company owned and issued device can also be secure. So I know it's a tough question. I would love to get a show of hands from the panelists, if you wouldn't mind. Show of hands, how many of your companies issue corporate owned devices to all employees? And do you do that for all of your employees?
Yes, for all of our employees.
Okay. All right. Wow, that's amazing.
Yes,
Yeah. And
so do we. So do we. Yeah.
You do too?
I just confirmed. We do it. We have the same policy, and so do we.
Yeah, I mean, it's this really interesting dynamic. And again, I come back to the power of choice and the importance of making sure that your employees' communications are going to be safe regardless. I'm in the camp that I try and point out to security teams that, look, we think that there's an opportunity to ensure security and compliance without having to issue the device. Again, trying to get away from having to carry around two phones. But I think that this is going to be a debate and a discussion that's going to play out over the next several years. And it's going to be very interesting. So,
Chris, if I may say, I mean, you don't have that liberty for having that discussion when you are in a highly regulated industry. So there is a limit to the statement about choice. There are some constraints, I mean, in terms of the execution flows of some highly regulated transactions that cannot happen on non-corporate devices. So it really depends on the industry. It depends on the regulation enforced, the type of monitoring that is required. But I accept the concept that we need to indeed have some options and be focused on the actual threats.
Yeah, I mean, and I appreciate that, Rami. I certainly understand. I mean, I think that the question that creates is, when we issue devices to our employees, does that mean that they stop using some of these alternative channels to communicate for business, right? And I think that the company needs, through a combination of policy and technology, put all the controls in place to protect their data, to ensure that they're compliant. But then you have to think about the reality that sometimes employees are going to continue to use these alternative channels and do business, even though it's not on their company issued device. And I think that that's where it becomes a challenge. And I don't think we have to look far to see a lot of evidence of that, right? You look at literally, billions of dollars in fines that the SEC has handed out because bankers and employees have continued to use these channels. I think it was Morgan Stanley who recently stated that they're going to fine their bankers up to $1 million personally if they're caught using an alternative channel on a device that's not monitored or issued by them. They're not going to fire them because they like the fact that that employee is productive and brings money in, but they'll issue personal fines. So I think it is a challenge, and I think that the issue of devices and who owns them and how you communicate will persist. But I don't disagree with you, Rami, that certain regulations are going to require certain actions and make certain policies unavoidable. So,
Chris, can I weigh in for a second, just for 1 minute? I think it's quite relevant. I mean, I think Gary, and you brought up some really interesting topics around two phones, freedom of choice, both a corporate phone and a personal phone. But one of the things, having run Mandiant and FireEye and doing a lot of incident response, that we learned, and this is even more true now, is that not only do you have the two phone system, you have multi-layers of access to those business communications, meaning most of the executive, CEO, top level have administrators who also access an email or some sort of other Slack or Teams communication on behalf of the executive. And one of the cases is pretty famous, a very large bank, I won't name who, but had a big spear phishing breach. And the ultimate breach point was an administrator who was essentially doing emails and other communications on behalf of the executive, trying to reduce the amount of volume that was coming through those channels. And then we ended up doing a simulation, a spear phishing simulation for that bank. And the CEO brought in over 350 executives, and we did the test prior to an executive offsite. And it was almost shocking. The CEO made everybody stand up who fell for the second spear phishing attempt. And the number was 56% of those executives fell for the spear phishing the second time. This is even after a big breach through a spear phishing. And the bulk of them occurred through the administrator, because the administrator wasn't quite as aware as the executive, or maybe it was even the executive too. But you not only have the business phone and the personal phone, you have the access issues to those comms as well. That's gotten very complex for most organizations. And so not only is that regulation a problem, the threat is a problem too. So interesting situation we're all dealing with.
Yeah, completely agree, Dave. And I think that speaks to the number of vectors of attack that a bad actor can take advantage of. And they can be technology vectors, they can be human vectors. And as the attack surface expands, either in terms of number of devices or number of applications, it can be an overwhelming problem. Okay, Dr. Layton, I would love, and I think that as we mentioned, what kind of spawned the popularity of a lot of these alternative ways of communicating was mobile devices. And some of the various channels that people use every day now, it's no longer just email, but it's collaboration applications, it's conferencing applications, it's mobile messaging applications. So when you think about securing communication risks, whether that be inbound threats or outbound threats, how do you go about managing those? How do you think about that problem?
So thanks for the question. It's one of those questions where there's There's a tremendous amount to unpack here. One of the panelists talked about the methodology with which one has to think and act, and certainly budgetary constraints within a regulated environment, within a regulatory environment. That's a little different in terms of how you see the threat and how you have to respond to it. You know, coming from the government, that was a little different as well. I want to focus for a moment on financial services. They're typically, it's the 3-line of defense model, where you have the business, that's the first line. Second line, challenge, their responsibility is to challenge first line. And of course, this audit function, which is supposed to challenge a second line. I want to, phrase the comments that way by saying this. I've always seen first line, this whole notion of human factors. Human factors are typically what's going to get you every time. So I think we're way beyond. Dave talked about this earlier in his wonderful summation of the state of security events. This whole notion of education is wonderful. That's a big deal. It can't be overlooked. It has to be done. But when you're talking about things like generative AI and the sophistication of threat actors, we're way beyond that, because the level of these threat actors has just gotten so sophisticated. So I'm ready to say this, is that, the lifeblood of bad actors runs through a personal model that I have, that typically bad actors are going to leverage what I call my 3 C's: curiosity, complexity, and convenience. One of those, 2 of those, or all 3 of those are going to drive that conversation as to how you select, whether it's 1 phone or 2 phones. You talked about, whether somebody having the ability to have an informed conversation about choice. It's all about being able to leverage all of those tools to reduce that vulnerability. But the point is, it's really hard. And one of the things that I think everybody is going to be excited about to hear is this whole notion that you guys do very well of an ontological architecture. Because at the end of the day, what we're really talking about with those human factors, it's what's real and what's not. If there's a way to determine that's real and that's not, then I've got another way to actually get a chance to, to mitigate some of these vulnerabilities. So for me, it's all about some technique where I can have a common operational picture and combine my user identities. That's, to me, that's one of the golden tickets to be able to make a determination of whether, I'm dealing with somebody who's real or who's not. It's just really hard.
Dr. Layton, I love the way you talked about factors, right? And it's not just technology factors, it's human factors. And these are challenges that you need to look at holistically to really solve the problem. Certainly education is part of that, but it's also got to be a technology answer. And
people go outside of these standardized channels primarily because it's convenient. And that's one of the things that bad guys are very aware of. There's another one of those C's that I didn't talk about. That's for the law enforcement people. I would tell you that bad guys are more collaborative than the law enforcers. And that's another thing that's just, it's frustrating. I've seen that over my time, especially in the Secret Service, is that's one of those things that just really, it's speed to target. And when you talk about the method that the cops use to go chase the bad guys have always been more collaborative, always.
So I'll tell you, and I think this is, Adam, I think Ron just touched on this, and it's this fact that human beings are, you didn't say this, Dr. Layton, but you kind of referred to it, alluded to it. The human beings are always going to be, as I like to call it, the biggest variable and the biggest kind of question mark. Human nature is that we are trusting. Human nature is that we are going to tend to want to assist people or be collaborative. And this kind of speaks to the emerging threats of social engineering and language-based attacks. And you think about traditional technologies, log-based technologies, agent-based technologies, relying on things, and I'll get a little technical here, like OS query. Well, OS query obviously basically looks at all the metadata in and around a transaction or a device or an application. And what that technology does not do is help you see inside of a communication application to see what's actually being said. And it's those conversations where social engineering occurs, appeals for assistance, appeals for, or urgency or deception. It's conversational. And that's why bad actors are relying on those techniques, and they're doing it in new channels that are unmonitored as a technique or method to execute their attack.
Technology is supposed to be an accelerator of human performance. In other words, how do we all get it done more efficiently, much faster? And that's where the bad guys take advantage of this whole notion of convenience. Can you do it quicker? Can you point and click? Can you cut and paste? And that's where the vulnerability goes way up exponentially. And I'll shut up. I've talked too much.
No, that was great. And I think it's this great segue into social engineering and how should companies go about addressing that challenge. And Adam, I love your perspective as, a part of Marsh, and you think about risk a lot, and you're both a practitioner but a product person. So how do you think this challenge of language-based attacks or social engineering?
Yeah, well, first of all, Chris, I love this discussion. I love all the different angles of the discussion. I love the behavioral component of the discussion, because you absolutely nailed it, and the panelists nailed it too. I mean, those practitioners, we've always known this is a human problem, but now even understanding that, the exponential component of that is almost mind-boggling, right? So I was going to say, I mean, growing up as a kid in the 80s, if anyone can relate to this, we were the last generation of leaving the doors unlocked at night, right? We would never think about that in today's world, right? But back then, there was that trust. There was that trust in your neighbor. There was that trust. It's fine. You go to bed. It was just inconceivable, right? So companies nowadays, there's a great equalizer. It doesn't matter which company size you are. There's basic hygiene that needs to be adhered to here. Right? It doesn't matter if you're a small startup, or it doesn't matter if you're a large enterprise. I mean, you still need to have a security awareness training program. You still need to consider MFA. You still need to consider endpoint protection, these sort of elements. That goes without saying. But the real problem is right, the layered approach, and from what Dr. Layton and other folks have talked about here, the sophistication from what we're looking at here, we're in what I call this kind of contextual battlefield, right? Where social engineering, it's about psychological manipulation and behavioral analytics, and AI sits, front and center in this contextual battleground, right? So they're looking for ways to contextualize the attack, right? So they're looking at the culture, they're looking for tone, they're looking to make it seem real. And then it's up for companies now to figure out contextually how to combat that, how to look for the outliers, right? How to things that it's almost counterintuitive. Well, that doesn't make sense that someone would provide that tone and that context through that medium, right? So it's such an interesting time to sit there. And I know obviously this is near and dear to SafeGuard's heart here when we think about contextual AI and what that means. But, it's really in many ways legitimized. Social engineering is really a key business driver for these threat actor organizations. The ability to kind of breach a network and camouflage your presence, observe corporate culture and persona behaviors over time, and then really act in context, to make requests seem very realistic. And so you really test the limits of that human component there. And they're doing this to the tune of, $3 billion in 2022, which is a staggering number. And that's just from business email compromise.
Well, Adam, look, as you're preaching to the choir. It is it's scary because you're right. The taking advantage of human vulnerabilities and human susceptibilities is something that social engineering has always relied on. But now we've got the added problem of bad actors, which were oftentimes located in foreign countries, or they weren't native speakers in the language where they were attempting to execute the attack. And as a result, the fact that they weren't native speakers will often come through in the email. There was a very obvious grammatical error. There was a very obvious, incorrectly formulated sentence, and
Mhm.
that was enough for the human eye to be able to detect, well, something's off here. So you
Right.
need to continue that training, but in a world where an attacker can now type into ChatGPT for advice on how to write an articulate message requesting a certain action be taken, and that it be very persuasive.
Yeah.
I mean, it's going to be, I think, nearly impossible for the human eye to detect that level of deception.
Right.
So, I mean, I'd love, Adam, I'd love to get your thoughts on this. Prabhat,
Yeah.
I'd love to get your thoughts on this generative AI challenge and how that relates to social engineering and targeting human vulnerabilities.
Yeah, it's a problem. This is the evolution of what was the basic hygiene and how that really needs to evolve, right? I've been with some companies that have done awareness training well and others that haven't. The ones that did it well were really contextualizing it. They put it in the context of culture, right? That everyone needs to think about it. This is a formal job responsibility, right? And I would take it a step further to say, I think it should be performance related, right? It's not about firing people. It's not about, it's more about, no, you're performing. This is part of how you're being evaluated in your job function, right? And this is how everyone, Dave made a great point about having access, right, to that. This is something everyone needs to think about. And so that comes from a cultural dynamic of this is about how we think about our company. This is how we secure our company and really what you can do about that, right? And of course, with that, it's that continuous training. And it's not as much even kind of pushing from a compliance standpoint. I really love the companies that routinely send out these sort of A/B tests, right? And see who will actually bite on these sort of emails in this sort of context, right? Put the dual controls in place, right? With money transfers. Usually it's a threshold. You can even lower that threshold. There should be dual controls where even if a CEO is requesting something, if it seems a little bit out of context, I mean, it shouldn't matter because there should be other controls in place before that can even be implemented, right? That's something that supersedes even a CEO influence. So I think there are things that companies can do. Now, with that being said, changing company culture, especially in really large organizations, is obviously quite difficult, right? But that tone needs to be set at the top. I think it's easier for smaller companies to get there, but having the backstops behind that. I'm a huge proponent of tying in things like threat intel, right, and hacker chatter from a security standpoint in terms of that contextual analysis and what you're looking at from that analytic standpoint. How do hackers think? What are groups targeting? What are the techniques they're using? And roll those back into your training programs. Get some real world examples in there, right? It also creates more of a strategic function for security along those lines. So I think there's a level of creativity, but the culture and the tone really needs to be set from the top on that. And for those companies that have been able to do that successfully, I think you see some of the better results.
Yeah, great insights, Adam. PK, how about you? What are your thoughts on Gen AI?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Great insights here. Yeah, we had to, I mean, at Navan, we were early adopters of the technology. The app is pretty much built on this technology. So, I mean, I had to look at it from a 360-degree perspective, overall from a people, process, technology perspective, right? What I mean by that is we are using AI in our product workflows. Engineers are using it to build, write, test, deploy code. Our internal, operations teams are using it for all kinds of productivity, kind of benefits here. So from a security perspective, each of these aspects on the product platform side, on the developer side, and also on the internal operations, we had to look at it separately and do a 360-degree risk assessment for each of that. But specifically in the context of business communication and phishing, I mean, we run our own kind of a threat intel program here. I'm just seeing a massive influx in these attack vectors, right? I mean, I'm just seeing the numbers literally linearly skyrocketed over the last couple of years, which makes it very evident that the threat actors are using this technology to, craft phishing attempts, to have, kind of identity-based attacks and all of those things. So I think the only ways to combat this is to adopt and embrace this technology and then build our defensive techniques and with good partners who are actually embracing this technology. Otherwise, we'll be left behind. Yeah, those are my thoughts.
Yeah, no, completely agree with you. I think, it is going to require, it's going to be a battle of machines in a lot of ways. Bad actors are using these machines. I know that the security organizations are going to have to rely on similar technology to combat and detect these threats. Again, great insights. Christoph, I know you have specifically have some responsibility on AI and how to leverage that at Bosch to help make the company more secure. What would you like to add to this conversation?
So it's really fascinating, and so generative AI is such a powerful technology in boosting your creativity. It's like everybody has his own junior consultant who will help. However, it's after all a junior consultant. He won't tell you if he doesn't know something, and he's not completely honest, and he can't keep a secret. And however, still it boosts creativity, but you can't let it work unsupervised. And this makes it for defense difficult. It's a better help for creating attack weapons, for finding zero-day exploits more quickly, or for orchestrating automatic attacks, because an attacker has to be once right. But for defender to orchestrate things with generative AI tool, which might not work in all circumstances as reliably as it should, it's difficult. So here again, it's one of the situations where technology is front-running technology helps attackers more than defenders, because defenders need to have really reliable technology, but at least we can use it for our own internal processes, for being perhaps more productive in writing deceptions also. But still, it's a technology. It's incredible, powerful sword that cuts both ways, and we have to deal with that.
Christoph, you just said something that is a question I love to ask. You talked about the fact that bad actors, attackers, they only have to be right once, right? And the good actors, the security teams need to be right every single time. So in a world where we're all resource constrained, and in a world where we are oftentimes overwhelmed with alerts, how do you go about, how would you guide someone in terms of developing a strategy to prioritize what they respond to versus what's kind of lower on the priority list? Recognizing it's hard to respond to every single alert you receive, every single technology you have.
Yeah, so we come to the 3 C's again. Reducing complexity is really important, and if you set out for a complex task, you have to create yourself an overview. Have a situation picture, a map, and here AI can help you to structurize things so that you have a clear overview, and it can digest data very efficiently, so that you can come to important decisions faster. So as decision support system, as means providing overview, reducing complexity, and even writing deceptions in a way that they are, for instance, not just pattern-based, but behavioral-based, so that you can reduce the number of false positives, and this again reduces complexity. So those are powerful mechanisms you can utilize, and making AI work for you. Still, for an attacker, there are plenty of other possibilities as well, but it's not that defenders can do nothing here. Yeah, it's a powerful technology for us as well. But yeah, it gives our opponent more power, which is something I don't like as a defender, of course.
Yeah, I mean, it is a never-ending escalation that we
absolutely
all have.
Old game.
Yeah, Christoph, thank you. Okay, we're going to get the last question to you, Rami, and this is something that I always, again, I'm curious of. In a world where there's literally hundreds, probably thousands of different cybersecurity vendors, and There's always new threats and vulnerabilities that practitioners have to contend with. I recognize that you don't have unlimited budgets, right? You can't buy every single tool that is presented to you. So how do you go about, as a practitioner, recognizing when there's a tipping point, when the risk has reached a level where you have to make an investment to address an emerging threat? How do you think about that? How do you recognize tipping points and moments in time where you have to bring on new types of technologies to battle new threats?
Thanks for the question and great conversation so far. So, I mean, as Dave mentioned earlier, we're living in a world of tipping points. I mean, plural. There are a lot of tensions, a lot of shifts impacting technology, impacting regulation. So we are pretty much, from a practitioner standpoint, under pressure. Having said that, I think we're also having some incidents where we observe that some principles such as defense in depth were not really adopted in a lot of environments. So a lot of environments where substantial investments were made on technologies, on tooling, without understanding the architecture of the defense in depth. And for me, that's an important consideration when you're looking at a new investment in cybersecurity. To what extent you're reducing pressure on your existing controls, to what extent you're improving the effectiveness, and to what extent whatever you're introducing is going to add value by having more actually interlock and more interaction with your existing mesh of controls. So we cannot really continue to operate in isolation. We really need to connect the dot between what we have in the environment. So for obvious reasons, we focused on the human factor, which continues to be a weakest link. A lot of things can be done in terms of being able to dynamically assess if we're dealing with an abnormal behavior and trigger the right control, whether it could be, authentication, selective authentication, or even push for MFA. That kind of thing needs to really be part of a chain of control. So this is like a key consideration, is really how this new control or these new essentially investments or tool plays with the existing control. The other consideration, obviously, is to what extent this is helping us perhaps displace some other investments, because there is, as you said, this concept of cost and this concept of also operational impact of introducing new solutions. So I think, and maybe this is a controversial statement to make here, but the point solutions, the era of point solutions is really over. I mean, for a lot of environments, we're looking more for platforms that can address class of risks and class of issues. So if we're talking specifically about communication, it's about how we secure communication across all the different channels, and to what extent what we start deploying on one channel could become, in a way, the new protection, the new control that we deploy for other channels. It may not happen right away, but in a phased approach, that's a key consideration. I think another aspect is really the architecture of the control that we put in place. So you hear it all the time, agent versus agentless type of technologies, and the impact that has on resilience and the performance. That's actually a real consideration as well. So defense in depth, making sure that we are taking more of a platform approach and also understanding the architecture of these new controls that we're introducing in the environment.
I love that. Yeah, Rami, that's great. You're right. It is an ecosystem of people, process, and technology. There's a lot of layers to that ecosystem, and you have to make sure it all works together. So great insight. Okay, so we're just going to wrap it up here. I'm going to walk through briefly an overview of SafeGuard Cyber and our First Sight platform, and then we'll call it a day. But great discussion. So SafeGuard Cyber's First Sight platform covers so many of the topics and issues that we talked about today. And if there's three things that I want to make sure that the audience understands that First Sight does and the values that it provides, it's these three things. Number one, it's this concept of full visibility. It is a platform. We give you the ability to secure and create a compliant environment in email, conferencing, collaboration, mobile messaging channels. We allow you through a single console to get visibility into all of these communication channels. And not only do you get a unified view, but you get very, very deep visibility. I mentioned this briefly earlier. We're not just looking for anomalies in metadata associated to accounts or users or channels. We are actually going in and reading the full text of the communication. And this is what enables us to detect threats that the traditional security stack misses, specifically these language-based attacks and social engineering attacks that are being targeted against your employees. That's number one. Number two, it's this concept of contextual AI. And I'll talk about in a little bit more depth in a moment what we mean by that. But at a high level, it's our ability in First Sight to leverage multiple analytics techniques to detect, to detect threats that are being targeted against your employees. And then the last piece is the concept of impact AI. In a world where we are overwhelmed with alerts and it's very difficult to respond to them all, it's not enough to just detect a threat. You also need to understand the potential impact that that threat may have on your organization. And these are what we call the three pillars of value and differentiation from SafeGuard Cyber's First Sight platform. And very briefly, a look at the architecture. If you look at the top of this slide and look at this slide in layers, across the top, it lists the various channels that we help secure. We are deployed via API to API integration. So that means no agents required, no data feed setups required. So it's a very, very low friction deployment and architecture that allows you to be literally up, running, and having visibility in a matter of minutes into these communication channels. After we integrate and get visibility into these channels, we go through a data normalization process. And data normalization is key because each one of these channels have different APIs and gives you access to different information. And normalizing that data is critical if you want to be able to have good, strong, high efficacy, high accuracy analytics. The contextual AI layer that I mentioned is our ability to leverage multiple analytics techniques. So we're using large language models to analyze the conversations that are occurring in these channels. We're using behavioral analysis to detect anomalies in metadata. We're doing social graph analysis to look for unusual or new relationships and conversations. And we allow you across all of these channels to use these analytics techniques to detect threats. We focus primarily on three different categories of policies or use cases. One is business compromise, and we're very deliberate in saying business compromise as opposed to business email compromise, because all of these threats are occurring outside of just email channels. So it's not just business email compromise. Insider risk, it's our ability to detect malicious insiders who may be leaking or exfiltrating data that's sensitive and confidential or proprietary to your business. And then, of course, we also provide you the ability to maintain compliance with regulatory agencies and your company's policies by archiving these conversations. And then this next piece, impact AI, is what I alluded to a moment ago around our ability to not just detect threats, but to help you understand the impact associated to a threat. Is this potential impact financial? Is it related to business operations? Is it related to intellectual property or brand damage? And we have a scoring system that we've developed based upon our big data backend and our ability to understand ontological relationships that allows us to help you understand as an investigator, how big of an impact could this threat have on my business? And this allows you to better prioritize and understand what you need to respond to immediately or maybe something you can get to a little bit later. And then obviously all of this is presented to you in a way that's highly actionable so that you can respond accordingly. And as I mentioned, we focus on 3 different categories of use cases: business compromise, insider threats, archiving, and compliance. And we are a platform that really allows you to be both secure and compliant across all of your communication channels. And if this is of interest to you, if this is a challenge that you are thinking about and want to address, what I always like to say is, let us prove it to you. We are happy to do proofs of concept at no charge, where we can come in and monitor your communication channels and help you understand if you've got threats that you weren't aware of, and help you become more secure and more compliant. Well, with that said, I want to thank everyone for attending today. I want to sincerely thank all of the panelists and participants. We appreciate your support. We loved the conversation and found it very, very interesting. So thank you all very much, and have a safe and great rest of your day. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you,
Thank
everybody.
you. See
Thanks,
you.
everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you,
Goodbye.
everybody.